This week on the BackTable podcast.
What I always tell students is that there isn't one singular factor that you want, because IR is such a clinical specialty. You really want to be consistently performing well throughout all of med school. So you want to, do the best that you can on all of your clerkships. What you don't want is somebody who just kind of cruises through with so much potential but doesn't exercise that potential except when it's necessary. Because as a program director, you then think, okay, well, it's great that you're interested in IR and you're going to do great on your IR rotations, but you're going to not care about all your other DR rotations. And what you really want is somebody who's going to be consistently good all the time. Because at the end of the day, that's the personality that's going to rise to the occasion of pushing the IR forefront further and further and further. Is that somebody's going to just bring their A game every day, irrespective if they like it or they don't.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the BackTable podcast, your source for all things endovascular and minimally invasive. If you're a new listener, welcome. For all of our regular listeners, welcome back and thank you for listening. You can find all of our previous episodes of the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or our website. That's BackTable.com. Subscribe to the podcast, leave us a written review, or check us out on social media. Let us know how we can make this podcast better for you, and we'll do our best to make that happen. Today, we're going to be discussing the relatively new IR residency. We have two guests on today who are going to offer their unique perspective, and their background will kind of give us some clue as to what their perspective is going to be. And we have two doctors on today, Doctors Jeffrey Bodner and Bill Majdalany. Jeff, can you introduce yourself real quick, and then Bill will jump over to you?
Hi, yeah, good afternoon. Thanks, Chris, for having us. So my name's Jeff Bodner. I'm technically a first-year radiology resident, second-year resident, and I'm here at Emory University here in Atlanta.
Awesome. And then Bill?
I'm Bill Majdalany. I'm the program director at Emory University for the IR integrated as well as the independent pathways.
Bill, how long have you been in that role?
I've been in that role at Emory University for, this is going on my third year right now. And then previous to this was a fellowship director at the University of Michigan.
Okay, nice. Excellent. So Jeff, will you kind of tell us a little bit about your background and training experience? I know it's limited up at this point, and then how you got interested in IR in the first place.
Sure, happy to answer that. So I had sort of a non-traditional background going into medical school. I actually was a chef prior to even doing undergraduate work. Through my own health experiences and being a patient, that sort of drew me in to healthcare in general, and some burnout from my prior job got me back into school. Through undergrad, I was fortunate enough to actually work as a technician in ICU for 3 of my 4 years of undergrad. There actually was fortunate enough to meet an IR private practice doctor who was often coming up to the bedside and rounding on patients. Through him, I really was thankful enough to basically volunteer and see some procedures on my days off. So that was kind of my first introduction. And in meds, when I finally actually decided to go to medical school, I sort of just kept it in the back of my mind until really third year rotations, and kind of really owned in on what I wanted to do. And I just kept falling in love with it. So that pretty much motivated me to continue down that pathway. And then there were some other subsidiary IR symposiums, involvement with the RFS committee through IR that really kind of just kept me wanting to go that route.
Okay. So, Bill, where are you at in terms of, I'm assuming since you've been around for at least 3 years, you went through the IR fellowship, the conventional old guy pathway, which I also fall into. So will you kind of tell us like how far like you've been in the game and how things have changed from the IR fellowship to the IR residency?
I think that's a great question, and thanks for having us, Chris. And,
of course.
And thanks for tackling this topic. I finished fellowship in 2012, and I stayed at the same place where I did my residency, and that was at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And I think what I've seen over the last 10 years, every specialty has ebbs and flows in competitiveness, and IR is one of those fields where there's this constant innovation. And, we see that procedurally on the front lines, but on the backside, there's also innovation on the way the education is happening and how people are being drawn into it. And I think those are the two things that I'm seeing more and more. So you see more people coming into IR earlier stages. I think that's a lot of credit to SIR, to the Med Student Council, as well as the RFS, the Resident Fellow section. as well as different avenues, whether it's this podcast or otherwise, where we're reaching more people at younger stages. When I was going through it, frankly, I didn't have an IR rotation in my medical school. I actually experienced endovascular procedures through vascular surgery rotations and cardiology rotations. And I kind of thought, wow, if you can do it in the vessels and everywhere else in the body, how much cooler would this be? And that's how I ended up, almost a leap of faith going into radiology, and then realizing that definitely IR was the field for me.
So when you went into radiology, it was with the intent, like you had a pretty good idea ahead of time that you wanted to go into interventional?
Yeah, I think if it wasn't for interventional, I probably would have gone into vascular cardiology.
Okay, interesting. So you touched on one thing that I wanted to bring up at some point, but how competitive is the new IR residency? But first, I want to hear about it from Jeff's perspective. Then I also want to hear about it from your perspective. So Jeff, from your perspective, like what's the word on the street in terms of competitiveness?
Yeah, it's very competitive.
Okay.
Last I checked, when I was going through the application process, it actually, I think, was the most competitive specialty. Maybe for numerous reasons. Maybe because of medical students really figuring out what IR was earlier on in their training, or just the fact that there still was a limited amount of spots, but there definitely was a lot more diagnostic radiology spots available. So I definitely felt the pressure. I always felt like I was criticizing myself for not having enough research or committee involvement. And so when I went through the application process, I considered that, and I did a lot of away rotations. I did 3 away rotations in IR specifically, and going through that, talking to a lot of fellows and different program directors and faculty, I felt really comfortable that if I really worked hard at it, I would get into IR at some point. It just may not be the clear pathway for me. So when I applied, I sort of ranked the programs based on diagnostic and IR at that one particular institution. And Emory was actually my number 1 spot. So I was really fortunate.
Awesome. Well, congratulations. So Bill, I would imagine that, competitiveness, it's probably a fraction, or it's probably like, based on numerator and a denominator in terms of like, how many people apply versus how many spots available. From your perspective, from the program director perspective, is it more like we do a fantastic job of limiting the access to interventional radiology, or is just interest way up?
I think you were spot on when you said that the ratio of applicants to positions it's been getting closer to 1-to-1. Whereas, initially it was just when there were fewer programs and fewer overall positions, it was 3-to-1, 5-to-1, et cetera. But even within those people who are applying, the quality of the applicants are excellent. So you're seeing people who have, everything, whether it's the board scores, the publications, the service, et cetera, across the board, that could really go into any field of medicine and be at the top of any program director's wish list. So those applicants are still there, but we're seeing a greater depth of just really high-end applicants overall. And what I end up saying to people is, as program directors, is don't just apply to the integrated IR. There's still a lot of reason to go into DR and diagnostic radiology, and if you can get a high-quality position in diagnostic radiology and then do an independent residency, you kind of get the best of both worlds as well. If you have an ESIR track, et cetera. But I don't want to get us ahead of any other potential questions.
No, so that's actually the thing that I wanted to really talk about next was, Bill, can you kind of speak to the different routes of getting into interventional radiology?
Oh, absolutely. So, we've been talking about the integrated IR residency so far, and this is truly integrated. So this is, you match in for med school and you have the next 6 years of your life planned out. You know where you're doing your internship, where you're doing your full radiology training, which is inclusive of both the diagnostic as well as your IR training. So you're kind of all set, you're good to go. But you have 2 other pathways if that's not the right path for you. And one is to match into a diagnostic radiology residency. So you can potentially do internship someplace, diagnostic radiology someplace, and then you have one of 2 pathways at that point. So one pathway is called ESIR, or Early Specialization in IR, and different DR programs will have different number of positions of these if they have it at all. The large majority of diagnostic radiology residencies will have an ESIR position or multiple of them. For example, at Emory, we have 3 a year. So if you do your ESIR, you basically commit to doing 44 weeks of IR-related rotations, including ICU, throughout your radiology residency years, as well as a minimum of 500 procedures. And then you go into a match for what would have been the fellowship historically, but now is the independent IR match. You roll the dice again in the match and you see where you go for your final 1 year of IR training. If your DR program did not have ESIR or you were not able to complete the ESIR requirements, you can still go into IR as an independent candidate, but you have to do it in the 2-year program. And you enter that same match with the ESIR candidates, and you have to do 2 years of IR training to make up for the lack of IR weeks in your radiology residency or number of procedures.
So it just like bring it to your home program. Do you guys have both the EIR program where you have 3 spots per year and people can match independently for a 2-year fellowship?
Correct. So we have the integrated, and we take 4 a year right now. We have the ESIR, which are the diagnostic radiology residents, which we take 3, but they don't necessarily have to stay with us. They can go anywhere.
Right.
And then we have the independent, which we match 6 positions a year. And those can either be ESIRs from other places or our own institution, as well as 2-year independents from any other institution, including ours.
Jeff, so not just from your perspective, but from like you and your peers' perspective, was there any way that's like preferred, or does each one of them have advantages and disadvantages? Like, are some people like, I would imagine, like for my personality, like I would just want to get into the IR direct, not the IR direct pathway, but the IR residency straight off the go and be at a place for 6 years. But I think there's also some advantages to like, having gone to 2 different institutions, learned procedures from faculty, maybe at Emory and then also at another institution. Was that something that was discussed and talked about?
Yeah, it certainly was. When I was actually going into away rotations my 4th year, I certainly, of course, was thinking maybe integrated IR was really the best route for me, because I knew that really was my interest in radiology to begin with, and I knew that I did want to stay at one institution, and I grew up in the Southeast, and primarily was happy to be back here in the Southeast. But with that being said, once I did away rotations, I had a lot of great advice, like I said, from other IR fellows, other residents, faculty at other institutions. And, most of them had not done their IR, their diagnostic training at their institution. They had gone elsewhere. And, kind of getting their perspective, and then also just kind of realizing that everyone just seemed to have this, work hard mentality, and they were really passionate about it. I just felt like I was going to find a way into the specialty, if I just kind of kept that passion. And I think that's really what was that I'd like to, tell people that are going through the application process or they're considering IR. I definitely did my rank list, basically diagnostic and IR at one institution. And then I would go down the list of institutions, because I was ranking places based on not whether I was just going to do all IR. Some colleagues of mine definitely had put all their IR slots in the match first, and it wasn't based necessarily just on the institution. Like, they were much rather happier matching an IR at a less well-known institution rather than having to match in diagnostic at a more well-known institution. And so I didn't necessarily feel that way. So I certainly was happy to the way I did it.
So Bill, from your perspective, do you think that, no matter which way you get into IR, whether whether it's right off the bat or whether you transfer in mid-year or whether you go the 2-year fellowship route, that does the training all kind of shake out in the end, and that everyone's, SIR has designed it in a way that everyone's going to get good training. It's just, how you get it peppered throughout either 6 years or maybe a little tighter bunch towards the end.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. And if anything, I think over the last couple decades, the number of good programs has really increased. I think there's just a higher level of training that's more consistent across the country. And I think more or less wherever you go, some places may be a little bit better in some things or other things. You may have some experiences that are better here or better there. But overall, I think the quality of IR has really increased and improved over the last decade, if not more.
From my perspective, the doctors that are coming out now after training are like these super interventional radiologists, and they seem just overall better trained than I was. And, I'm only 5 years out. Bill, you're like 8 years out, right? Do you feel like these guys are just like some like super docs?
They're getting, I think, a broader exposure, and they're being pushed harder. I think from a program director's perspective, we really feel the impetus is on us to make sure that this training paradigm succeeds. So, we don't want other specialties or other radiologists to question the quality of the IR trainees, either their DR skills or their clinical skills. And we need them to really lift us up. So we want to recruit the best, of course. We want to invest in training them, and we want them to be better than our generation was. Granted, I'm kind of still in their generation, but we still are invested in them being better.
Are we, Bill? Are we? All right. So, Jeff, back over to you. Once you get into medical school, like, how do you get exposed to IR? Like, I mean, what was your personal experience in getting exposed to IR? And I know that you had someone that you had met early on, even before you got into medical school. But if you can speak more broadly to the medical students in general, like, what's your exposure to interventional radiology? Is it a little more thoughtful than it used to be? I can just tell you from my perspective, I had almost zero exposure to interventional radiology, and I'm hoping that's changed.
Yeah, that's a great question. So my first years of medical school, I really had no exposure to IR. I really focused on didactics and really knowing the fundamentals and really preparing for STEP. And a lot of people, are fortunate enough to get these other research experiences in the summer and et cetera. Or they may have mentors that they shadow in between block exams. But no, I that's what I primarily focused on. And then really third year, we actually had no radiology rotations at our med school. Actually, I would say wasn't really even encouraged. There was so much focus on the core specialties, medicine, surgery, OB-GYN, peds, even internal medicine and family medicine. So what I did, actually, I was so scared because this is a second career for me. I was like, I don't want to make the same mistake twice and pick a career and have to go back and realize I don't want to do this. So I actually third year started on internal medicine, and I think I had some pretty long days. And instead of studying like I probably should have to some degree after my rotations, I'd be done at 3 or 4 o'clock. I would walk down to interventional cardiology. I would shadow vascular surgery, and then I also ended up kept going back to IR. I met a lot of great mentors at the hospital I was at. Thankfully, it wasn't such a big institution where people really didn't know you. Or really, it was like, once you saw someone's face and you spent a day with them, they really remembered you. And I just, always just kind of showed a lot of interest, whatever I was doing. And I think that really kind of, if I could give any advice to especially a third year student who really doesn't know what they want to do with their life, I think that really was a key point for me, is just consistently hanging out with as many different specialists as possible, things that you just may have never even considered, because I wasn't going to get that experience based on the curriculum at my school. I know other medical schools are much better at maybe incorporating other specialties outside of the primary 6 your third year. I just knew that I wasn't going to get that experience unless I sought it out.
Sure. Bill, how is it at Emory? Is there anything that you guys do to improve medical student exposure to interventional radiology, or is it having to wait for people to show interest and then you kind of bring them into the fold on the back end?
Well, I'll tell you, there's a few different things that we do, both at Emory and that we contribute to on a national and regional scale. And I give my trainees a lot of credit, in particular Jeff, because they're involved with the med students in different ways, both in the IR interest group that we have, as well as a lecture series that we do for the M1s at noon on a monthly basis. We also have a foundations elective where they come and can rotate with us in clinics starting in M1 year. Separately, a trend that has happened across the country is these medical student hands-on symposiums, because this is a way to reach out to this new core of med students that are really who we have to recruit directly from, right? This is a new paradigm for IR. So aside from those things, from an SIR standpoint, there's obviously the Medical Student Council now, which people can participate in. And we have scholarships available for medical students to attend the SIR through in-training scholarships. And for me, that's how I actually first went to SIRs. I got a resident in-training scholarship while I was a diagnostic radiology resident. Prior to that, hadn't really been exposed to it. So I think these things have provided additional avenues for med students to be exposed.
That's awesome.
Bill, I'm glad you brought that up. If you don't mind, I'd like to echo that. As far as the medical student symposiums, I actually did go to the Emory one my third year. I think it was in April the year I went, and I went to a few other ones as well. And it was a great experience, just getting a chance to talk to, faculty, other students that were interested, residents, and then I was also fortunate enough my fourth year when I had already applied. They had the student scholarship to go to SIR, and it was just an amazing experience. And only wish I had done it the year before.
That's awesome. So what I wanted to talk about, and Jeff, you mentioned it earlier that you had done 3 away rotations, and that kind of prompted me to think about, like, so what are some of the things that medical students can do when they're in medical school to make themselves more competitive, whether it be, just crushing your step scores, or going on away rotations, or just doing well in your regular coursework. Like, what are the things that are important to getting into a good IR residency?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I do think it's variable, really depending on your personality and knowing your own strengths, and then B, sort of figuring out like what type of IR practice you're interested in. There are several places that are much more focused on research and publications or committee involvement. For me, I think I just really wanted the face-to-face interaction and to show that I was very passionate about IR. I worked hard. I was going to be there early and stay late and just really get as much exposure as I could and talk to people. I found that to be a strength for me. I don't know if that's a strength for everyone, but I certainly feel like I'm a pretty social person. So I've sort of benefited from that. Certainly got more interviews because of that as well. So that did help me. And I think I probably wouldn't, it really helped me actually get into Emory, to be honest with you. I mean, I really felt like I had a great experience here, and I was able to shine through that. Other things, I wish I had got more exposure to research my first years. I didn't really have that. I know a lot of people, I certainly, that I was doing interviews with, many had publications, many had, several things standing with different IR institutions with, different research publications. Also, I had only found out about the RFS with the different committees a little later in my third year. I tried to sort of slowly get integrated into that. But I definitely recommend that to medical students because it definitely gives you it basically allows you to really dive deeper into, current issues in the specialty. And then really kind of you get to know people through that. You really get to have good conversations. So I guess for me, that was sort of how I, rounded, my application off. And then honestly, I definitely touched on a lot of my prior background in cooking, and I think that probably not a lot of people have that necessarily going into an application, but I think there were some interesting analogies in IR or in any medical specialty to working in a kitchen as far as the long hours and the work ethic.
Sure, I get it. It's it's called a differentiating feature in the biz. So we can go right to the source because you got into Emory. So Bill, why did Jeff get into the residency? Like, why choose him over? I'm sure what you had a pool of fantastic applicants.
He cooked us a lot of good happy hour snacks. we were still at the hospital and we were hungry, and Jeff took care of us. From a program director's standpoint, I look at the whole package. You want somebody who can pass their standardized exams, but I don't really put scores as an isolating thing that makes me choose somebody or not. And, we're moving away from the step one actually having scores reported, right? It's just going to be a pass fail.
Actually, can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's probably like a different thing. Like if you've been out long enough, you probably don't even know aware of this.
Yeah. So in the coming years, step one, we always used to say, oh, you want to step one over 230, 240, 250, 260, 270, whatever number, that's actually going to no longer be reported. It's just going to be a pass fail. So if some programs had a cutoff number, that's no longer going to be a way to potentially filter candidates. All you're going to get is a pass. Now, if that work against you or for you? Well, it probably depends a little bit on your perspective. If you're from a med school where you're networked and has a stronger reputation, it may not hurt you for it to be just a pass fail, because if you did poorly on step one relatively, then you're still buffered, right? But if you're from a smaller school that may not be as networked, may not have a radiology residency or an IR residency, or people to vouch for you or get you connected, that could be a way that you could have stepped out from the rest of the field if you had a ridiculously astronomical step 1 score. And that's no longer going to be there for better or worse, however you look at it. I'm not a believer in isolated scores in selecting somebody, but this is something that is going away.
So you were talking before I interrupted you about like the total package or what you're looking for in an IR applicant. And so, if you could paint a picture of like the person who is like the best fit for Emory, is it a combination of things? Is it also a combination of that person with your program? Like that's another question that I want to kind of dig into is like, is there like a personality of the program that you're trying to look to fit, or you're always trying to bring in different people that, they help mold the personality of Emory?
I think it's a little bit of both. And part of that is because we're a program that's fairly large in size for an IR integrated residency taking 4 a year. That's a little bit on the bigger side. I think the trainee that fits in best here is somebody who's going to be resilient and elastic. And I think part of that is because we just have different stressors. Being in a bigger city, you're going to be going to different hospitals and using different computer systems, sometimes, from 1 week to another. Electronic medical records aren't always the easiest, and different PACS systems are not always the easiest to adjust to. But what I always tell my residents is that, once you've achieved that learning curve, you're going to be able to go from one system to another system, and you've actually experienced all the different vendors. So whichever practice you go to, whether academic, private, or otherwise, you'll be prepped to handle anything because you've experienced it all. But if somebody really just wants one single location, one predictable thing, this may not be the best fit for them. Because here we are going to go to the VA. We're also going to go to an inner city safety net hospital in Grady, which is a major trauma center, as well as a pediatric hospital. And then you have all of the Emory hospitals, which is 4 and counting. Now, trainees don't go to all of these hospitals, but they're going to go to many of them.
So once a medical student decides that they want to do interventional radiology, what is some good advice as to where do you want to focus? I mean, because in my estimation, you're always, as a medical student, you're always a little pressed on time. Like, where can you devote your resources? But Jeff, if you could give some advice to like a medical student who's like year 1, knows that when they want to do interventional radiology, what's the best advice that you could lay out for them in terms of like, what do you want to do to maximize your chances of getting in, maybe not to the best IR residency, but the IR residency that you want to go to?
Yeah, that's a great question. And just to touch on what Bill was saying, and about basically them getting rid of step 1 and it being pass fail rather than a score based system. I did use the scoring to my advantage because I came from, a lesser known medical school, and I focused a lot on really getting those high scores. And, I was, somewhat at least successful with that. Now that things are changing, and if you're going to be a part of the upcoming medical students that are going to have pass fail step 1, I would just say really get out and network. I joined SIR earlier on. I love actually getting on the SIR Connect forums, always just seeing what people were talking about. I learned things through that, actually, just looking at even just different techniques, or if there's a symposium going on, it's often being posted on SIR Connect. Again, like I said, join the resident fellow and the RFS committee for SIR. I think that's a great way to network as well. Try to go to SIR, try to get involved with the student scholarship. They have a research, I think, summer scholarship that they have available if you're interested in that. A lot of these are, paid. They often take care of your travel, and it's a great experience if you have that available. Other than that, I really would say make sure that I still was questioning like a lot of, people's certainty on a specialty your first year and second year of med school. I always found that interesting that people will start medical school and they already know what they're going to do. And maybe they have some clinical exposure already to that. And they've, been a nurse practitioner or PA or whatever before. But I would certainly just say be open and never be closed-minded. I certainly think that you benefit from knowing knowledge from everyone. So if you're on a surgery rotation, try to get the most out of that rotation that you can. And that's kind of what I harped on a lot. Everything that I was exposed to in med school, I really tried to focus on that at the given moment. That will make, that really made me better in my clinical skills for sure. And that's very important. Other than that, research is always being harped on. I remember in interviews, it often came up. If you can get your hands on, any kind of project, residents are often sometimes overworked and they don't necessarily have time to do all the project themselves. they're often looking for medical students to get involved. I'm certainly always trying to recruit medical students as well to help me with my projects, because it's really hard to do sometimes independently, if depending on what rotations you're on. Yeah. So, I mean, I think those are a few things. There's probably several other things I didn't touch on, but I think for me, that was sort of what helped me. So one thing that I wanted to mention was, I did do my transitional year here at Emory, for my intern year, and being at the same institution for all throughout your residency was super helpful. Getting to know the EMRs, getting to know the people, getting to know where things are in general in the hospital and the city, not having to move twice. I can't harp on enough. Like, wherever you end up, just consider it. I certainly benefited from it with our transitional year program. We had 2 months of radiology. One of those was IR. I had two non-medicine electives. One of those I did vascular surgery. I really got to know a lot of the people. And then, when you're getting phone calls about consults or referrals, whatever, oftentimes who's on the other end of the line, and it's really helpful. I mean, I had a lot of good relationships with people during my intern year that still carry forward today. So that's just something that I think you should keep in your back of your mind, because you often don't think about your intern year very much when you're applying to radiology, because it's only 1 year.
If I could just expand on that for just 1 second, I think there's two really important points to make. One is that intern year, if you do it at the same place, really gets you plugged in on the research side of things too. And then doing high quality research sometimes does take several years. So your chances of producing manuscripts, going to SIR, et cetera, increases. And at least what we do is we have a dedicated intern year that we're developing for our IRs that includes trauma surgery, vascular surgery, surgonc, hepatology, et cetera, in addition to ward months and everything else that you would do in an intern year, ICUs and ER months, et cetera. And I think the trend that's starting to go across the country is that programs are going to become categorical programs. So everything's going to be built in at the same place. We did that at Michigan with a prelim surgery year built into the IR residency, and then we're going to be going that route at some point here at Emory as well with a transitional year.
Wow, that's really neat. I mean, one, there's a lot of value in like just having like a categorical match where like, you get plugged into the system so early. But one of the neat things that you're going to really start to reap a lot of benefits on like later, Jeff, when you're like in your 5th or 6th year, that, some of these like services are run by like the upper level. And these will be people that you've done your intern year with. And like, there's just something that breaks down a lot of barriers whenever like someone just calls you on your cell phone, and they're asking you for a hand. It feels less like a dump and more like, a consult, or like someone's like really like reaching out, asking you for help and building those relationships. It's a smart thing to do, like when you're an intern, but even when you guys move out into private practice, like that's one of the things, like when you get to know your referring docs and get to be like friends with them, it like builds a sense of community that, because it takes a team to take care of people these days.
Yeah.
So, Bill, can you speak to the same thing from a different perspective? So, if you're running into, and I'm sure you actually probably talk to medical students all the time. I bet you they come knocking on your door. And what advice do you try and give them as far as tightening up their resumes, or just where to spend time and devote some of their energy?
What I always tell students is that there isn't one singular factor that you want, because IR is such a clinical specialty. You really want to be consistently performing well throughout all of med school. So you want to, do the best that you can on all of your clerkships. What you don't want is somebody who just kind of cruises through with so much potential but doesn't exercise that potential except when it's necessary. Because as a program director, you then think, okay, well, it's great that you're interested in IR and you're going to do great on your IR rotations, but you're going to not care about all your other DR rotations. And what you really want is somebody who's going to be consistently good all the time. Because at the end of the day, that's the personality that's going to rise to the occasion of pushing the IR forefront further and further and further. Is that somebody's going to just bring their A game every day, irrespective if they like it or they don't. And that's what I really try to glean from anybody's application in particular is this person a serious person? Do they truly have a passion? Are they really living up to their potential? Or are they just kind of cruising and they can turn it on when they want, but they're kind of, not doing it as often as possible. So
right, like if you're lukewarm for like pediatrics and OBGYN, like what does that say if like all of a sudden you're able to turn it on and like, crush surgery, but then you're kind of like, treading water for those other services? I get it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the interview process for interventional radiology. And if I can imagine, it can be a stressful process and time consuming. When you don't have a lot of time, it can also be expensive. Jeff, can you talk a little bit about how many different programs did you apply to? And whenever you were applying, did you have a goal of like how many interviews that you wanted to get to like statistically give yourself like a better shot? I mean, like, because I mean, imagine you just don't have infinite amount of time to apply to every single place or interview at every place.
Yeah. So I did apply pretty broadly to both diagnostic and interventional. I probably had a lot of interest in certain geographic regions and may have sort of ranked my programs accordingly to some degree of that, because I do feel like maybe that's not emphasized enough when you're a fourth year med student and you realize that a program is, you know, the best for you. But part of that is also the city you're living in. And I think that your time off should be cherished and you should probably enjoy where you're living. Other than that, I think that applying broadly, I would say that I definitely had more diagnostic radiology interviews than I did IR. And I sort of put that in the back of my mind, thinking that, you know, technically there's more diagnostic radiology spots than there are IR. So I certainly thought about that when I was doing my rank list. During the interview process, I would say that a lot of topics came up, and I really felt like maybe that benefited me a lot was just when I got to the interview point, I really relaxed and I sort of just I realized that, you know, at this point, we're all in the same playing field. It's really your job just to be yourself and to realize that whether or not you fit in there and the culture there. So I would often ask, you know, people lots of questions. And if I had not done an away rotation there, I certainly, you know, would do my homework and look up the institution and be prepared for any questions that came up.
I think that's actually really good advice that I wanted to just drill down on is like doing your homework about the program that you're going to. I know that I've seen applicants come through different organizations and they really just have no idea about the program. Like I've seen applicants like in some of the places I've been, they're like, "Hey, you guys presenting anything at SIR?" And I thought, man, like of course, like we're presenting stuff at SIR. Like, I mean, like we do it every single year. Like, but like he was legitimate. Like if I would have said, yeah, we're presenting one paper, he would have like been just as surprised if I would have said 30. And like it was just like just smacked of a guy that like didn't know anything about the program and hadn't like, you know, gone through the trouble. And like I'm even kind of a laid back guy. Like that didn't bother me at all. But like, you know, like some people who are, you know, if you put out a couple papers a year, that would, you know, and you're steeped in academics and research, like that can be a little bit offensive. Like if someone just says, "Hey man, what are you presenting at SIR this year?" You know? But anyway, so like, I just wanted to drill down on like, do your homework on these places. You know, some of these people that you'll interview with have big egos. And so you don't want to just like come in there and not have like done a little bit of research about who you might run into.
And just to echo that too, I mean, like these programs put a lot of work into figuring out whether or not they even want to interview you. They have a lot of great people that are applying that you're competing with. And it's kind of almost disrespectful. Like if you're not even bothered to look up them as an institution and what their culture is and, you know, what things are important to them. I just found that kind of surprising. I definitely ran into a few people on the interview trail, to say the least, that really had just flown in and they didn't know really anything about the city. They didn't know anything about the institution. So
Sure.
that should be a given.
Yeah, man.
If I could interject, there is one thing that's actually been different in the last year, and that's where we've gone to virtual interviews. You know, because of
Very
COVID.
interesting.
So people aren't visiting, right? There aren't the lunches. You're not getting to see as many groups of residents and take tours. Now, you know, different places have virtual tours and YouTube videos and things like that. So you don't have the same gut feeling about a place, which is something that I always tell people to trust your gut. And I've ranked my number one place based on my gut. So I think that's been different. It remains to be seen how that's going to change. I think there are positives and negatives of going to the virtual route versus the in-person route. The positives being that it was less money for the applicants, right? Travel, and now you can apply to many more programs, and interviews really almost like half a day now. So you could do more than one interview potentially even the same day, which would seem crazy to my generation. But from a program standpoint, it also saved us money, but didn't really save us time. Which is something that was a little
Which probably was
frustrating.
something infinitely more valued as your time.
And the interesting thing is the number of applicants really went up. Now, is that because more people can just click, and more people who weren't going into IR are going, you know, just applying so broadly, even into multiple specialties trying to get in? It's really hard to say. So I think how that dynamic changes remains to be seen, but that's going to be something that's going to be an inflection point again, because the virtual interviews actually were pretty successful, I think. Now, it was different than everything everybody's been used to, but it actually worked out in some ways very well. So who knows what will happen? I think from our standpoint, it wouldn't surprise me if we stay on the virtual platform.
Wow, that would be very interesting. I think that anything that can kind of take the onus off the medical students. I just feel like there's so much burden in time in terms of your time and like the financial investment. I mean, so a part of me thinks that's really good, but then part of me is so old and steeped in tradition that I think, man, how can you pick a place without even having to like step foot in their cath lab? But
Or even move to a city that you've never lived in.
right. Yes. Very interesting. So, Bill, from your perspective, though, I'd like to touch a little bit on research and even if maybe it's if you can maybe speak even broader to like what program directors and how they feel about it. Does it just vary from program to program and maybe even from director to director, like how important the research is and whether or not it's important to be first author, second, I wonder if you could just kind of speak a little bit of that to some trainees out there who are putting a lot of pressure on themselves to get some things done.
Well, there's just so many different classes of trainees because you have some people who are MD PhDs who are necessarily have had grants and even maybe some patents and multiple publications, et cetera, right? And you're going to have people who maybe went to a med school that didn't have research opportunities, but they've excelled in so many other things and they've participated in the Med Student Council, and maybe they've done it through volunteerism and leading initiatives at their own place. And that's all fine. Don't feel like you have to. I always tell trainees, don't feel like you have to have 10 first author publications. From my standpoint, I'd like to see people participate in something if it was available to them. I mean, I didn't have an IR rotation and never mind IR research available at my med school. On the other side of it, we see people who sometimes apply and they have like 10 publications all on orthopedics. And it makes you wonder, it's like, did you just click IR by accident? So, or is this like your backup or what's going on here? And I think if you have such a strong focus in something that isn't IR, have the wherewithal to explain it in your personal statement. Like, what is your journey? What was your journey? So that personal statement is a really important way to tie together your application. Talk about the strengths of your application, but don't shy away from weaknesses or don't shy away from things where people would ask questions, because, this is your chance. We take the time to actually read all this stuff. We have a committee of 5-10 people reviewing hundreds of applications, and we're reading through and scoring them. So if something doesn't make sense to us and you haven't taken that chance to explain it, it becomes a question mark that if the rest of your application doesn't get you to the point of an interview, we never have a chance to resolve that question.
Understand. Jeff, I wanted to hear from you in terms of, are there any things that advice you can give as far as like what I would consider like cardinal sins of like the interview process or the application process, that if you can just avoid this, like you're going to like set yourself up above some of like, the bottom 10%, like any things that are like just total gaffes that just are unacceptable, like on the interview day or interview process, I should say.
Yeah, sure. I can probably touch on a few. I think a lot of this, I thought was like more common sense, but I guess it wasn't so common because I saw it on the interview trail. Professionalism is, to me, key. Like the first time you're meeting someone, treat it like, you're the big job interview that you're trying to get. I mean, you should be dressed in professional attire. You should be early, not even on time, like at least 5-10 minutes early. And then, ask questions like you're just really interested and know enough about the program. It was surprising to me, some people that would show up and they didn't know that, and they didn't know anything about the program, or they maybe had a few too many drinks on the social gathering the night before, where you get a chance to meet the residents and maybe some faculty will show up. And sometimes that's a great experience too, because you ask those great questions. But if you're the person that is having too many cocktails and you're saying things that are inappropriate, they're going to remember that, and the residents are certainly going to tell the faculty about it if there's any red flags. The last thing is really be honest. Like, it'd be amazing. Like, I heard some stories on the interview trail where people would just make up all kinds of things, and whether or not it was really even important, I don't know. But like, I mean, there was a guy that I know that said he could play the guitar, and like one of the program directors like loved playing the guitar, and he had one in his office, brought it out from behind the desk and asked him to play him a tune, and he couldn't play it. Like, how embarrassing is that? Like, and who knows if that's really even important? Like, it's just, just that all that matters. And then really just know your weaknesses. I mean, I knew my weaknesses going in when I was doing my personal statement. When I went into the interview, I was prepared to answer any questions that came up. And I think that was super helpful. But that was kind of the gist. I mean, really just be happy that you got selected for the interview in the first place. Like, try not to act like you're rushed for time and you've got to be somewhere else. Like, if you're interviewing Miami, don't act like you got to be on South Beach by 2:00 in the afternoon. Yeah, just common sense stuff, really. I mean, and just know that you may not be the best fit. I mean, you need to evaluate that for yourself. I mean, they're not just interviewing you; you're really kind of interviewing them. And you should have some valuable questions for them because you're going to be spending 6 years of your life there.
I think actually some of the things you said were fantastic piece of advice, but one of the two of which I wanted to drill down on were be on time and then have some questions. Like if you guys, like if this is like someone's listening to this and this is your first time going through the interview process, at some point during an interview, someone's going to say, "Hey, do you have any questions for me?" And I'd like to get Bill's perspective, but I think when you say no, you don't have any questions, I think that looks a little weird. So Bill, can you also speak to that? Like any just like cardinal sins, like things that you've seen where you're like, well, this person's out.
I think Jeff hit a lot of them from a PD standpoint. So be genuine. Don't put any white lies or lies in your application. Be able to talk about anything in your application, because what is interesting to Jeff or Chris or me may be very different than somebody else. And I've had people who, in their hobbies and interests said fishing. So I happen to love fishing. And if you go in my office, I have different fishing things in here. So I was asking him, I was like, "Oh, well, what do you like to go fish for?" And couldn't like name a fish.
Goldfish. Goldfish.
Yeah, I was like, okay. And you try to like not let it be awkward. So to a certain degree, you're like, but if they lied about that, what else is, that's such a minuscule detail within the scope of somebody's whole medical school training. Like, really, like, why would you do that? So be genuine, be nice to everybody. The program coordinators are really busting their butts too to make sure that they're putting everything together really well for you. Be polite to them. Don't be the person who sticks out to them, either being too rude or anything like that. And be the type of person other people want to be with. That's not to say that you have to be Mr. Popular or Mr. Loud or anything like that. But just, be comfortable in your own skin. Be yourself. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with being the jokester, but don't feel like you have to be like the person who is entertaining everybody. So just be natural, be cool, be chill, and be someone that other people want to work with. Because at the end of the day, we're going to do a lot of cases that are really long, and we're going to be working together. And, I can ask Jeff about a recipe while I'm there, right? Like, how do I truly fold an egg, Jeff? What's the right way to do that?
That's a whole nother podcast.
A whole nother podcast. Wow.
Kidding. One thing I also wanted to mention that I think Bill brought up some good points and made me think about, don't talk about other institutions. Like when you're on an interview, I mean, you're often going to run into some people on interview day. I mean, I know virtual is changing things a little bit as far as the social interaction between med students applying, but if you had a bad or good interview somewhere else, like, the day before or 2 days before, or you didn't like where you're at and you didn't like the people there, don't talk about that. Like that is something you keep to yourself and just put it in the back of your mind when you're doing your rank list. You'd be surprised how many people, you're sitting in a conference room waiting to get interviewed, and sometimes there's residents in the conference room with you just there to chat, and they're hearing what you're saying and they're not forgetting it. So if you're talking about, one institution and how, you didn't like the people there, or you didn't like the culture or the city, they very well may know people there and they may be great friends with those people. So it doesn't look good to you to sit there and bash programs. I certainly remember that a few times when I was on the interview trail, and I was just like, it's just very strange. Like, it's just, again, it's professionalism, really.
I was going to say, one thing that I would suggest people do is to do a practice interview. Mm-hmm. Ask for, one of the fellowship directors or program directors in that department, wherever you're at. It doesn't even have to be the same specialty, just to give you a practice interview. You haven't done an interview in multiple years, likely, and this is a different interview at a different level. In many cases, you don't know the questions you need to ask to evaluate a residency until you become a resident, and then you're like, oh yeah, this wasn't important to me, but this actually is. And the same thing happened to me when I went from residency to fellowship or fellowship to a job. It was my first job. I was like, oh yeah, I wish I had asked these things when I was interviewing for it. So always get the other perspective of what to ask, as well as feeling a little bit more comfortable while you're doing it.
Yeah, I think that's very sound advice. And one thing I also wanted to go back on to drill down on something, Bill, that you said is, I think being yourself is such solid advice. I think it works for a lot of different levels, but sometimes me, Aaron, and Michael, some of the BackTable hosts, get asked, advice on how to tune up a resume. And I always just tell people, lean into like what your true interests are. If you're not someone who's like particularly interested in research, then don't try and highlight that in either like your time or your, frankly, how you design your resume. If like you're someone who's like super strong in different like either leadership organizations, like we've plugged, I have to like link to the RFS because we've kind of like referenced them a couple of times today. I think that's like a fantastic way to get involved in leadership, and that's something that you can highlight. I think there's a lot of different strengths that applicants can have, and you don't necessarily have to be someone that you're not. Which I think is like what Bill was getting to a little bit earlier. If I can just tell like one story about like a guy that I interviewed with, like not that we want to tell like all the horror stories that we've seen out there, but this one I thought was just particularly egregious. So this was I was interviewing in New York, and I think it was Cornell, and so granted, look, man, it's New York. I'm sure it's like very difficult to get around. This, like, we're all in a conference room. It's like a conference room that seats 15 and there's 14 people in there. And so it's like packed with everyone. And then there's a knock on the door 45 minutes into like the chairman giving like an address to us. And it's one of the applicants. He's 45 minutes late. And then rather than just taking, okay, so there are two seats. There was one that was right by the door that the guy could have sat in easily. He picks the one that is all the way across the conference room, and he starts walking in front of the projector, and the chairman is like just acting like he's not there, but it's so obvious, like he's in front of the projector, and then he's like, "Oh, is that seat taken? Okay, it's taken." I'm like, "Oh my God!" It just kept getting more and more painful. And then he's like, "Okay, I'll come sit down here," and I just thought, man, why even bother showing up? There's no way they're gonna give you a spot. And it turns out that guy was a friend of mine. I was like, look, man, you're toxic. I don't need to talk to you during this interview.
That's great.
But I think we've all seen stuff like that. All right. So final thoughts. So Jeff, if you can give like a couple of pieces of advice to either people who are interested in interventional radiology or an applicant in interventional radiology or someone who's just like, man, I don't know between diagnostic or IR, like what advice would you give them?
Again, just always think about like everything that, when you're applying to these specialties, really just make sure that this is what you want to do. And make sure that you enjoy diagnostic radiology to a good degree, because that's a good part of your residency. And you need to be a great diagnostic radiologist to even be a good interventional radiologist. I think that a lot of people harped on, just being in getting an IR spot over just being at an overall great institution and, finding your way into IR through the other pathways. I would certainly say that was helpful. And then just to touch on, whether or not we go back to away rotations after, hopefully eventually in a post-COVID world, those were very helpful for me. I really got to know people very well, and whether or not I really enjoyed being there and the culture, and just got great advice. And I really, for me, that was super helpful. But other than that,
hold on, did you do an away at Emory?
I did, yeah. That was
okay.
I mean,
all right. Well, the proof is in the pudding.
It definitely probably helped me get the interview. I worked hard every day, and at least I think it is. I don't know. Bill can probably tell you whether or not that was true.
For sure.
But yes. So with that being said, and again, just stay involved with showing interest, not just talking to people, but like putting it to the paper, like whether it's research, whether it's committees, volunteerism. All those things, really, people see that, and you can put that on your CV when you're, going through the application process, and it makes sense. Like there's an evolution of like your interest and your commitment to the specialty.
Bill, so same question to you. If you could give some advice, like your best piece of advice to like, a budding interventional radiologist who's in medical school, hasn't quite gotten into the training program that they want, how can you kind of lay out the path for them?
I would say a couple things. One, I would talk to the people in the year above you who matched in different things and ask them why they did what they did. or why they went where they went. And I think that gives you an idea. So I think that post-interview, post-match networking is really important. It's frankly invaluable. Programs change and they change rapidly. You know, people may come or go, etc. So places that may have looked really awesome may not be, and places that were questionable may become awesome during the span of 5 years. The other thing that I would say is develop a good group of mentors and who you can bounce ideas off of. And you know, that's to say that they don't all have to be radiology or IR, but people who are going to be your letter writers, et cetera. Make sure that you have good relationships with them, that they're going to write you a strong letter of recommendation. I remember, you know, one of my own letters, one of the people brought this out to me and he goes, "Oh, wow, look at all these letters that you have." And he pulled this one singular letter. And mind you, you can't see the letter of reference that people submit for you. So I had no idea what it said. It ended up being 3 lines. It's like, "Oh, Bill is a sincere student." And I was like, "What? That was it?"
Dagger.
And, you know, I was like, you know, maybe not, maybe should have asked somebody else about that letter, you know? So get people who are invested in you, is I guess what I'm trying to say. Not people who just will say, "Oh, yeah, sure, I'll write you a letter," and you don't know what you're going to get. Make sure that what you're going to get is what you expect to get, because I expected to get an amazing letter out of that person, but it was just a letter. So, and then finally, I think the interview process was really telling for me to really reinforce that not only what I wanted to do would be radiology, but IR. At that time, we were still doing visits, of course, and you'd go to noon conferences, et cetera. And, you know, I'd go to all these prelim interviews for medicine and surgery and things like that. And I really just didn't like those programs the way I liked the noon conferences of IR and the field, the people that I was talking to, and just the general vibe. And so the interview process itself was reaffirming for me that what I wanted to do would be IR.
That's awesome.
Enjoy it. You know, it's a ride. It's one of the few times you're going to see so many different medical centers, whether in person or virtually, and you're going to meet the people who are pushing the field forward. So I think you learn a lot, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's a good life advice. Like, enjoy the ride, because doing the IR tour around the country, like, you get to meet a lot of fun, interesting people, and you might not get that chance again. So I'll offer one piece of advice for what it's worth. For both, when I applied to, you know, of course it's a different time, but I applied to residency, which was just radiology, and I applied to fellowship, which was independent of my residency. So as a medical student, I had the guy who's in charge of radiology. He was an IR guy. I was interested in IR early, and I'd done some work with him. And I just asked him, like, I just kind of went all in, and he could have said no, he could have said yes. But I said, you know, there's this one place that I really want to go to for residency. If you know someone, or if you would give them a call for me, I would love it. If you can't, I get it. You're a busy guy. He called and just, I think, put in a quick word. He was able to get in touch with the program director at my residency. And my residency director told me later on, he goes, you know, you were ranked. He's like, you might have matched, you might not have. But he's like, whenever you had that call, he's like, you know, not a lot of people get that. It was something that set me apart in a different way. And then I rinsed and repeated that advice. So I got to thank Peter Bream from my residency, who called my fellowship director. They were good buddies, and he put in a good word for me, which also probably helped. So I appreciate you guys coming out this Sunday and donating some time. Bill, Jeff, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
So totally our pleasure.
All right. To the audience, thank you guys for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast but want more, check out the show notes of this episode. One of the links that comes to mind, I think we definitely got a link to the SIR residence and fellowship section, the RFS section, which we mentioned multiple times during the podcast. But any other links, we'll throw them in there. If you enjoyed the podcast and want to support the show, here are 2 easy ways. First, take 1 second and press the subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening on. This helps platforms like iTunes or Spotify know that you, our audience, value what we're doing and you're interested in getting our latest content as we're producing it. Second, if you're really getting value from these podcasts, please go to iTunes, leave us a short written review. This helps us in a ton of different ways. That about wraps things up. We'll see you next time on the BackTable Podcast. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.